Good evening, and welcome back to the Bedtime Sleepy Historian. You're listening, perhaps, in the soft hours of night, when the streetlights hum, the air stills, and even the clocks seem to tick a little slower. Wherever you are, lying beneath a quilt, or drifting by candlelight, take a deep breath, and let your shoulders loosen. Tonight, we travel to the murky alleyways and echoing halls of medieval Europe. A world of wooden shoes clacking on cobblestones, of candle flames trembling in the wind, and of whispered rumors, the kind that kept villagers awake long after curfew bells. But these are not the stories of kings and knights you've heard before. Tonight's stories are quieter, stranger, and sometimes unsettling, tales of theft, deceit, obsession, and crimes that history almost forgot. So settle in. The past may be dark, but here, it glows faintly, like an ember left in a stone hearth. The Candle Thief of Saint Denis. The year was 1327. Paris, that grand and restless city, still smelled of wet hay and wood smoke after a week of spring rain. In the northern quarter, just beyond the bustle of the markets, the Abbey of Saint Denis rose like a grey island, its towers pointing upward through the mist, its bells calling monks to prayer. And there, at the edge of the abbey yard, lived a man named Etienne. Etienne the chandler, they called him, the candle maker. His workshop was a low stone room beside the stables, always smelling of beeswax and tallow, a smell that clung to his hair and clothes so thoroughly that even in sleep he seemed to glow faintly, as though his skin remembered the fire. Each morning before the sun lifted, Etienne would light a small taper and hang it above his bench. He worked in silence, melting wax in great iron pots, straining it through linen, then dipping long threads again and again until the candles thickened into shape. He hummed under his breath sometimes, small, tuneless sounds that kept time with the steady dripping of wax. It was quiet work, and lonely, but in those moments of warmth and scent and flame, he felt near to something holy. Yet holiness, in the medieval world, was a fragile thing. A man could spend his life making light for others and still live in shadow himself. And that was Etienne's burden. He had a wife, Marguerite, whose cough had worsened through the winter, and a small son with a limp who often went hungry. Payment from the abbey came not in coin, but in wax, which meant that Etienne had light, but little food. The monks said it was fair, for wax was dear and sacred, used to honor the Virgin and the saints. But hunger makes its own arithmetic, and Etienne began to count differently. At first, it was only a few candle ends gathered from the floor after Compline. He told himself they were scraps, too short to be used again. He took them home in his apron, melted them down, and shaped small tapers for his family. The first night he lit one, the little room seemed softer, kinder. Marguerite smiled, and their boy reached out a hand to touch the glow. Etienne thought, perhaps God will forgive this. But forgiveness, like wax, has a way of melting and reforming into something else. Soon the scraps were not enough. He began to slip whole bundles into his satchel when no one watched, long, pale tapers meant for the altar of Saint Denis himself. At home, he melted them down, pouring the golden liquid into crude molds carved from clay. He sold the new candles in the market, whispering that they were blessed wax, from the abbey, candles that carried the prayers of monks. People paid well for such comfort. And so it went. Each night, the abbey cupboards grew a little emptier, and Etienne's table a little fuller. The monks grew suspicious. Father Guillaume, the sacristan, kept the keys upon his belt and muttered of devils that fed on holy light. He ordered new locks, new seals, new prayers. But still, the candles vanished. The spring rains returned, washing soot from the city walls. And one night, when the abbey bells tolled midnight, Etienne stayed late in his workshop. He poured the last of the wax into a mold shaped like a saint's hand, a commission for a merchant's wife. The air was heavy with heat. When he lifted the mold, A thin stream of wax ran down his sleeve and burned his wrist. He hissed, more from guilt than pain. He thought of the virgin statues above the altar, their faces solemn, their candles burning night and day without complaint. He wondered what they would say if they could see him now, stealing the very light meant for them. He almost stopped. Almost. But need is a stubborn thing, and pride is quieter still. The next night he returned, his steps careful on the damp stones. The moon was a thin coin over the cloister roof. He slipped inside the storeroom, lifted a bundle of candles from the shelf, and froze. A voice behind him, calm, too calm. Etienne. Father Guillaume stood in the doorway, a lamp in his hand. The flame trembled, caught in the draught, and the shadows of both men wavered against the wall. For a long time neither spoke. The dripping of wax filled the silence like a heartbeat. Finally, the priest said softly, "You steal the light from God." Etienne wanted to explain, about the hunger, the illness, the boy's thin face in the glow of the candle, but his mouth filled with ash. He only said, "I give it to those who need it." The priest shook his head. "The saints decide who needs it." They took him before dawn, and by noon the whole quarter knew. The punishment was not death. Theft from the church rarely was, if one confessed quickly. They stripped him of his tools and exiled him from the abbey's lands. The monks cleansed the workshop with incense, then sealed the door. For weeks afterward, they said the place smelled of honey and smoke, and the scent would not fade. Etienne wandered the outskirts of Paris, selling what little wax he had left. Some said he became a beggar, some that he joined the candle-makers' guild in another town. But there were those, mostly washerwomen and gravediggers, who swore they saw him years later, in the churchyard of Saint Denis. A thin man with wax-stained hands, lighting a single candle at each grave. They said he never asked for coin, only murmured, "One light for those who have none." No one knows where he died. But in the records of the abbey, written in careful Latin, there remains a small note beside his name. Etienne dismissed for the theft of holy goods. His candles burned cleanly. It is a strange epitaph, almost merciful. Perhaps, in some way, they understood that a man who lived among flames might one day be consumed by the need for their warmth. And so, the story ends as quietly as it began. The monks continued their prayers, the bells their tolling. The light returned to the altar, pure and plentiful. But on certain damp nights, when the wind curls through the cloisters and the last candle trembles on the sill, a few still whisper before locking the cupboard, "May no man steal the light again." And in the stillness that follows, you can almost hear it. The soft hiss of wax meeting cold stone. The faint scent of honey. The kind of silence that holds both guilt and grace. The poisoned communion wine, Florence, 1374. Florence, the summer of 1374. The Arno River moved like liquid glass beneath the bridges, sluggish and green in the heat. The air smelled of rosemary and dust, and the plague, though its worst years had passed, still lingered like a rumor in every breath. You could tell it in the way people avoided touch, in how they crossed themselves twice instead of once before eating bread, and in how the church bells never seemed to stop ringing, for one reason or another. In the narrow quarter near Santa Trinita lived a widow named Lucia di Franco. She was neither rich nor poor, only tired in the quiet way that settles into the bones after too many years of waiting for something to change. Her husband had been a mason, proud of his craft, until one spring morning he was accused of stealing tiles from a merchant's yard. The accuser was a priest, Father Matteo, who claimed to have seen him carrying them away. The merchant believed him. The city guards believed him. And within a week, Lucia's husband was gone, first to the jail, then to the grave, taken by fever in a cell that smelled of mildew and prayer. For a long time, Lucia said nothing. She wore black, baked bread for the clergy, and bowed when she passed Father Matteo on the street. The priest would nod, a small, polite motion, as if he had forgotten her name. But Lucia remembered his voice, the soft precision with which he spoke falsehoods. It had the same cadence as his sermons, measured, calm, certain. Years folded quietly over her grief. And then came the summer when the sickness returned, not as a flood, but as a slow, creeping shadow. The markets emptied, and those who still went to church did so with trembling hands. Father Matteo continued to hold Mass, his robes pressed, his words clear, his chalice steady. Lucia, now older and thinner, continued to bring him loaves of bread, as she always had, baked with olive oil and thyme, wrapped in a cloth that smelled faintly of smoke. No one can say when her thoughts began to darken. Perhaps it was the day she saw a rat crawl across the church floor during Vespers and no one dared move to stop it. Perhaps it was the week she spent nursing a neighbor who died coughing blood, while the priest stayed behind locked doors. Or perhaps it was earlier still, the day she first saw her husband's hands through the bars, still calloused from honest work, trembling in the damp light. Whatever the reason, by midsummer, Lucia's patience had hardened into something else. She still brought her bread to the church, still knelt and whispered her prayers. But she began to grind the leaves of oleander, white and bitter, into a fine powder. She mixed it with honey, then with wine, tasting none of it. A small act, she told herself. A balance restored. On the feast of Saint Anne, she walked to the church before dawn, when the cobblestones were still slick with dew. The door was unbarred. The sacristan, weary from the heat, had left it open for air. Inside, candles smoked lazily on the altar. She moved quietly, as one who belonged there, and poured her mixture into the small copper pitcher used for communion. A thin swirl of gold, then gone. When she left, she pressed her fingers to her lips, not in prayer, but in farewell. The Mass that morning was small. 15 souls, perhaps 20, scattered among the pews. Father Matteo stood at the altar, his voice steady as always, his Latin clear. When he raised the chalice, the congregation bowed their heads. No one noticed the faint tremor that passed through his hand. He drank, as priests must. And then, after a long pause, he whispered the closing benediction with a strange, hollow tone. They say he fell ill by nightfall. The records describe fever, pain of the chest, discoloration of the lips. He lasted 2 days, either confessing nor accusing, his breath sour with bitterness. When the church bells tolled for his passing, they sounded almost relieved. Lucia did not attend the burial. She stayed home, tending her oven, watching the light move across the wall. Some said she wept, others that she smiled faintly, as though releasing something she had carried for too long. When questioned later, she denied everything. "I only brought bread," she said. "The Lord provides the rest." No trial followed. The city was too weary of sickness to chase another rumor. But the monks recorded the event in a careful hand. The priest Matteo, taken by poison or by providence, died July the 21st. The church stood empty for many weeks. People whispered that the chalice was cursed, that its rim carried death. No one touched it, not even the sacristan, until autumn. By then, Lucia had disappeared. Some believed she joined a convent under another name. Others said she wandered south to Siena, where widows could live quietly, and no one asked about the past. Centuries later, when the church of Santa Trinita was restored, workers uncovered a small wooden box sealed behind the altar. Inside were fragments of a cloth and a bundle of dried white flowers, oleander, brittle as bone. No note, no name. Just a faint trace of something bitter on the air when the lid was opened. Scholars still argue over the story. Some insist the priest died of plague. Others point to the widow's bread, the timing, the coincidence too sharp to ignore. But perhaps truth, in the medieval sense, was never about proof. It was about balance, and the quiet weight of things unspoken. In the end, the tale remains the same. A woman wronged, a priest unrepentant, and a chalice of wine that glimmered faintly in the morning light. No miracles followed, no vengeance from heaven. Just silence, thick and holy, settling over the pews. And if you were to stand there now, centuries later, in the cool shadow of Santa Trinita, you might still catch a scent on the air. Not incense, nor wax, but something sharper. Something that reminds you how thin the line is between faith and fury, between prayer and poison. The candles burn quietly. The stones remember. And outside, the Arno flows on, patient, unjudging, carrying everything away. And in the background, faintly, a church bell tolls once. And the sound drifts through the hot Florentine night, settling softly on the water. The Miller's Hidden Bones, Yorkshire, 1291. Yorkshire, in the late 13th century, was a land of wind and water. The mills turned endlessly beside the rivers, great timbered creatures groaning under the push of the current, their paddles dripping and glittering in the pale northern light. Each village had one, and each miller held a power that no one spoke of openly. He measured the grain, ground the flour, and took his share before handing it back, always a little more than his due, yet never enough to accuse. People whispered that millers were born under a different moon, that their hearts beat to the rhythm of turning wheels and rushing water, that they could cheat without guilt, smile without warmth, and sleep without dreams. In the hamlet of West Rillington, there lived such a man, Robert the Miller. Broad-shouldered, pale-eyed, with a beard like damp straw. He kept his mill on the River Derwent, a place where reeds grew tall, and the air always smelled faintly of stone. He lived alone, except for a dog named Bracken, an old hound who watched the door and barked only when the moon was new. Robert's reputation was complicated. He was clever with his trade, fair enough to avoid wrath, but rumored to keep secrets in the lower chambers of his mill. Children said they saw lights there at night, flickering through the cracks in the floorboards. Farmers claimed to hear the wheel turning even after the river froze. And once, a shepherd swore he saw Robert standing waist-deep in the icy water, whispering to something unseen. But the village needed its flour, and so they looked away. One winter, a merchant's apprentice, a boy of 15, named Thomas of Filey, came through West Rillington carrying a satchel of grain owed as tithe. He was to deliver it, grind it, and return by dusk. He never returned. For weeks the snow fell. The rivers slowed, the tracks vanished. It was easy to blame the weather, or wolves, or simple misfortune. The boy's master mourned quietly, lighting candles at the church and muttering about God's will. And Robert kept grinding his grain, his wheel turning, his face unreadable. Spring came, and with it, thaw. The villagers gathered near the mill to mend the weir, the low barrier of stones that helped direct the current. As they lifted the timbers, one man called out. Something pale had lodged beneath the beam, tangled in reeds. At first, they thought it a bundle of cloth. Then they saw fingers. By the time the sheriff arrived, the body was little more than bone and hair, but the shape of a boy remained. Around his wrist was a strip of red wool, the kind worn by apprentices in Filey. The sheriff asked questions. Robert answered them all. He said the boy had come late, after sundown, that the river was high, that perhaps he slipped on the stones. He spoke slowly, with care, like a man shaping flour into dough. And though his words were plain, his eyes did not soften. The sheriff, uneasy, searched the mill. He found nothing, only sacks of grain, a few tools, and a damp cellar where water pooled near the stones. Still, he felt watched. The air seemed thicker there, as though something held its breath. He ordered the doors sealed until judgment could be made. That night, Robert was seen walking along the river, lantern in hand. He stopped often, looking toward the water, as if speaking to it. By morning he was gone. They searched the banks, the woods, the downstream marshes. They found only Bracken, the old dog, sitting beside the mill door, silent, eyes fixed on the river. When they opened the mill again, they found the wheel still turning, though the sluice was closed. No one could explain it. Weeks passed. The sheriff, uncertain, declared the case concluded by divine will. The mill was abandoned, its timbers left to rot. People avoided the place, saying the water there had grown restless. At night some swore they heard the steady creak of a wheel still grinding beneath the moon, though the building had long collapsed. Years later, during repairs to the bridge, workers uncovered a second skeleton, smaller than the first, laid carefully in the mud beneath the mill foundation. The bones were clean, the skull tilted slightly upward, as if listening. Beside it was a ring of stone, smooth and deliberate, not a grave, but a circle. A ward, perhaps. A prayer. Or a warning. The parish record from that year notes only this. At West Rillington, the mill once of Robert was cast down, for unholy acts were whispered of. The water runs clear now. But the locals still tell the story differently. They say Robert bargained with the river for his fortune. That each year it demanded a life in exchange for the grain he ground. When he failed to offer one, the river took him instead. And on certain nights, when the mist rolls in thick as wool, they say you can see him standing in the shallows, sleeves rolled, hands working some invisible wheel beneath the surface. Of course, such tales twist easily over centuries. Perhaps he was simply a man of greed and silence. Perhaps the boy truly slipped, and the miller's guilt was only that of mischance. Yet in medieval minds, chance was rarely innocent. Everything had meaning. Everything balanced upon the edge of God's unseen scale. And so the story lingers. Half crime, half haunting, wholly uncertain. The millstone's long gone, its wood repurposed for barns. But if you follow the old road down to the bend of the Derwent, you can still find a patch of earth where nothing grows, and where, even in summer, the ground feels damp and cold. The sound of water there is strange. Not a ripple, but a slow grinding, as though the river remembers what it once turned. And in that sound, if you listen long enough, you might hear something softer still. The faint creak of timbers, and the low hum of a man singing to himself. While in the background, the wheel keeps turning, and turning, and turning. The monk's disappearing manuscript, Canterbury, 1312. The year was 1312. The bells of Canterbury still rang each dawn, echoing through mist and the scent of damp earth. Pilgrims came and went, their footsteps hollow on the flagstones, their prayers fluttering up like startled birds. And in the shadow of the great cathedral, a smaller, humbler world went about its quiet work. The monastery scriptorium. It was a long, low chamber lined with benches and narrow windows. Light spilled in thin slices, enough to see the curve of a quill, the sheen of wet ink, the edge of a page trimmed clean. The monks sat in near silence, heads bent, copying texts word by word, their breaths shallow, their spines aching. Every page was an act of devotion. Every letter, a step toward eternity. Among them was Brother Aldred. A man neither young nor old, with steady hands and an expression that never quite settled into peace. He had joined the order after a life in trade, leaving behind debts and rumors best forgotten. Within the cloister, he found structure, and in the script, a kind of fragile redemption. For years, his work was ordinary. Sermons, psalms, the lives of saints, nothing to disturb the quiet rhythm of the quills. Until the spring of that year, when an unusual commission arrived from the Archbishop's steward. It was a codex, half-finished, bound in calfskin, the pages faintly perfumed with lavender and something darker. Its text concerned the miracles of St. Dunstan, Canterbury's own sainted archbishop, who had once, as legend told, seized the devil by the nose with a pair of tongs. But this book was different. Between the accounts of holy deeds lay empty leaves, numbered and prepared, as if waiting for something yet unwritten. Brother Aldred was assigned to complete it. He accepted with a bow, though the task unsettled him. The commission came not from the abbey's abbot, but directly from the steward, a man with gold-threaded sleeves and eyes that missed nothing. Aldred was told to write what was given to him, and nothing more. For several weeks, he copied diligently, his quill tracing each word in measured lines. Then, one morning, he found a folded scrap upon his desk. No seal, no signature. Just a single line in unfamiliar script. "There are truths beneath the miracles." He frowned, tucked it into his sleeve, and returned to work. But the message gnawed at him. The next day, another note appeared, slipped between the pages of the codex. This one contained a name, Ealdwine, and a place. The crypt below. The crypt. Few went there willingly. Its air was cold and close, its lamps weak. Dust lay upon the tombs like a second skin. Still, that night, when the others slept, Aldred crept down the narrow stairs, his lamp flickering against the walls. He found the tomb marked Ealdwine, its carving worn nearly smooth. At its base, a crack in the stone. And within it, the corner of a parchment. He drew it out with trembling fingers. It was a page, torn, stained, but legible. And what it described was no miracle. It was an account of money, of land taken in St. Dunstan's name but kept by certain clerics for themselves. A record of theft, written centuries earlier, and carefully hidden. The handwriting matched the steward's notes. Aldred understood then. He was being used, his quill to rewrite not faith, but history. To sanctify corruption beneath the gilded veil of a saint's life. He should have burned the parchment. He should have confessed. Instead, he hid it beneath his robes and returned to his desk. That night, he began to copy, not the miracles he was told to write, but the truth he had found. He filled the empty leaves with names, dates, deeds. He wrote quietly, by the smallest of lights, until the ink nearly froze on the page. For a week, nothing happened. Then, one dawn, the codex was gone. He had left it closed upon his desk after Compline. When he returned, it had vanished. And in its place, a single feather, black as pitch. He searched everywhere. The scriptorium. The dormitory. The library vaults. No trace. When he asked the steward, the man smiled faintly and said, "Perhaps St. Dunstan himself reclaimed it." His tone made the jest heavy. Aldred fell ill soon after. Some said fever, others penance. He muttered in his sleep of wings, and eyes that watched from the rafters. By winter he was gone. The codex was never found. But years later, when repairs were made to the floor of the scriptorium, the workers uncovered a hollow space beneath Aldred's bench. Inside it lay a bundle of pages, brittle, darkened, yet still readable. They contained both the miracles and the accusations, woven together in strange symmetry. A saint who tamed the devil. A church that bartered with one. The abbot ordered them sealed away, declaring them unfit for contemplation. And so they were placed within a chest, locked, and buried beneath the crypt's oldest stones. Only one marginal note remains from Aldred's own hand, written in faded ink at the bottom of a page now kept in the cathedral archives. Every light casts two shadows. One seen. One remembered. No crime was ever confessed. No punishment recorded. But the monks who worked beside him swore that, in the weeks after his death, the scriptorium quills would sometimes move by themselves in the night, drawing faint, looping letters upon the parchment, as though some unseen hand were trying to finish what had begun. And when the candles burned low, and the brothers looked up from their desks, they would sometimes see a feather drift down from the beams above, black, weightless, landing softly on the page. And in the background, the sound of scratching quills and slow turning pages merged with the wind through the cloister windows, and the quiet hum of something unsaid lingered there until dawn. The Cobbler's Midnight Visitor, Prague, 1386. In the year 1386, Prague slept beneath a restless sky. The river Vltava wound darkly through its bridges, whispering against the stone. Taverns had long gone quiet, and the cathedral's bell had just rung midnight, a deep, patient sound that rolled across the rooftops like a breath. Down in the cobbler's quarter, a thin thread of lamplight glowed behind one small window. Inside, Master Yannick knelt at his workbench, the smell of leather thick in the air. He was a modest man, neither rich nor known, his back bent from years of mending the shoes of men who walked farther than he ever would. He lived alone, though he sometimes spoke aloud as he worked. To the hides, to the nails, to the silence itself. That night, he was finishing a pair of fine boots for a merchant's son, supple, black, with brass buckles that caught the lamp's flame. Outside, the rain had just begun. Soft at first, then steadier, until it beat a quiet rhythm on the shutters. Yannick paused, listening. He liked the sound. It was a kind of company. But then, through the patter of the rain, came another noise, a slow, deliberate knock at the door. 3 times. No more. He hesitated. Midnight visitors seldom brought good news, especially in a city still whispering about heretics and thieves. But habit and curiosity made him rise. He opened the door. A figure stood there in the rain, cloaked from head to heel, face shadowed by the hood. In one hand, a small bundle wrapped in cloth. In the other, something that glinted like a coin. "Are you Master Yannick?" the stranger asked, the voice low but clear. "I am," Yannick said. The figure stepped inside without invitation, the rain following for an instant before the door shut behind. Under the lamp's glow, the visitor's cloak glimmered faintly, as if woven with threads that caught the light too well. "I need your craft," the stranger said. "A pair of shoes made to measure. Strong enough to last a long road, but quiet enough to leave no sound." Yannick frowned at the wording. "No sound?" The stranger nodded. "Yes. They must make no sound at all." He placed the bundle on the table. Inside was leather, blacker than pitch, smooth as glass, with a smell that made Yannick's eyes sting slightly. It was like no hide he had ever touched. "I will pay well," the stranger said, setting down a coin. Gold, but duller than usual, as if time had already touched it. Yannick's first instinct was to refuse. But something in the man's voice, or was it the way his shadow did not quite move with the flame, held him silent. He nodded instead. "I will need a night." "That is all you have," said the visitor. And, turning toward the door, added, "I will return at dawn." Then he was gone, leaving only the faint scent of rain and something colder behind. Yannick stood a while before moving. He locked the door, trimmed the wick, and began his work. The leather cut cleanly, almost too easily, curling beneath his knife like ribbon. The thread, which the stranger had also brought, shimmered dark blue when wet, and though he pricked his finger more than once, no blood came. Each stitch seemed to tighten the air itself. Hours passed. The rain lessened. And slowly 2 shoes took shape, slender, perfect, silent. He tested them upon the floor. No creak, no tap, not even the faint brush of sole against wood. Nothing. It was as if they drank the sound. Satisfied, he set them upon the bench and doused the lamp. But as he turned toward his cot, he noticed something. Where the shoes stood, the floorboards were wet. Not from the rain, but from within, as though the damp had risen up to meet them. He bent closer. The air smelled faintly of river water and iron. He slept poorly. Dreamed of footsteps moving through his workshop, though no one walked there. Dreamed of the Vltava rising, whispering against his door. At dawn, the stranger returned. The light outside was gray, cold. Yannick handed him the shoes, wrapped in linen. The man examined them briefly, nodded once, and paid a second coin. Then, just as he turned to leave, he said, almost kindly, "You have made them well. When I am finished walking, I will come back for you." The words struck Yannick like a draught of cold air. He opened his mouth to ask what that meant. But the man was already gone. And where he had stood, there was only a faint print upon the threshold, wet but fading fast. That evening, a city watchman came to the door. He asked if Yannick had seen anyone near the bridge. A body had been found there at sunrise, face pale, eyes open, mouth full of riverweed. No marks, no wounds, only the soles of his shoes, worn to nothing, though they looked new. Yannick shook his head. He said nothing of his visitor. That night, he hid the coins in a jar and tried to pray. But when he closed his eyes, he saw water lapping against stone, and heard faintly the sound of footsteps moving behind him. Footsteps that made no sound at all. Weeks passed. He stopped working after dark. He left the lamp unlit after Compline, and kept the door barred. Still, sometimes, in the blue hour before dawn, he would wake to find damp prints across the floor, leading from the threshold to his workbench, and then fading away. When winter came, the river froze, and Yannick thought perhaps the haunting would end. But one morning, as he opened his shutters, he found something resting on the sill. A single shoe. The same kind he had made. Dry. Untouched by frost. And inside it, a coin, dull gold, cold as stone. He buried it behind the chapel that night, beneath a frozen patch of earth. He never spoke of it again. Years later, after his death, the house was sold. When the new owner tore up the floorboards to repair the rot, he found the same coin jar still hidden beneath the boards. And beside it, two prints pressed deep into the wood. Not human. Not animal. Just two shapes, like the idea of feet. Burned faintly into the grain. The story lingers still. Told in hushed tones by old cobblers who work late by lamplight. They say that once every generation, a stranger in a black cloak visits the quarter, asking for shoes that make no sound. And those who make them never last long after. Some say it is Death himself, seeking silence for his steps. Others say it is a sinner walking until forgiven. But all agree on this. If you ever hear knocking at your door at midnight, and the air smells faintly of river water and iron, do not open. Better to let the stranger walk on, and fade back into the dark streets of Prague, where the lamps burn low, and the river keeps whispering secrets to the stones. And in the background, you can almost hear the rain begin again, steady and soft, washing away the sound of steps that never were. The Widow's Trial by Candlelight, Rouen, 1402. Rouen in 1402 was a city that smelled of wax and wool, smoke and sanctity. Its cathedral rose like a mountain of stone, its bells heavy with the weight of prayer. Beneath its arches, the air was cool and full of echo, a place where voices seemed to confess themselves even when they only meant to speak. In the quarter near the old market lived a woman known as Isabeau le Mercier. She was neither noble nor poor, though she had known both states at one time or another. Her husband, a wool trader, had died 4 winters earlier, leaving her with his debts and a quiet, disreputable independence. She kept a stall by the quay, selling candles of her own making. Some plain, for lighting the home. Others twisted and colored, for charms whispered more than spoken. People said her wax burned longer than any others. That her hands left warmth in whatever they touched. That she could look at a person once, and know what weighed on their soul. And in an age of plague, hunger, and suspicion, such gifts were dangerous to possess. It began with the merchant's son. A boy of 17, handsome, careless, full of laughter that did not reach his eyes. He bought a candle from her one evening before Lent. A black one, small, and said to reveal truth in dreams. 3 nights later, he was found wandering the street, fevered, muttering of faces in the dark. By morning he was dead. His mother said the candle was cursed. His friends said he had sinned. The priest said little, but crossed himself often when her name was spoken. And soon, the whispers reached the city watch. On the evening of March the 9th, they came for Isabeau. She did not run. She only folded her apron, washed her hands in the basin, and followed them through the narrow streets to the bishop's hall. The chamber was cold, lit by candles, not hers, that trembled in the draught. 3 men waited there, the bishop's clerk, the city's bailiff, and a Dominican friar whose eyes glimmered with fervor. They spoke of sorcery, of unnatural knowledge, of the devil's breath in wax and flame. Isabeau listened, her face still, her fingers clasped loosely before her. When they finished, she asked, "And how will you know what is true?" The friar replied, "By light. For light reveals what darkness conceals." It was decided that her truth would be tested by candlelight. If her candle burned steady, she would be declared innocent. If it guttered, if it wavered, if it died, then it would mean her soul was darkened, and God had withdrawn his breath. They locked her in the chapel that night. She was to prepare her own candle, from her own wax. It seemed merciful, but it was not. The wax was new, unseasoned, likely to sputter. The wick too thin. The air heavy with damp. All small things. But in such trials, small things decided everything. She melted the wax by the light of a single lamp, her hands moving with the calm of long habit. The flame trembled, its glow painting gold on her lined face. As she poured, she prayed. Not to be spared, but to be seen truly, even if it meant her end. She whispered for her husband, for the boy who had died, for all those who had been silenced by rumor. The candle cooled. She carved a cross at its base. Then she sat in the silence until dawn. At sunrise they came. The chapel was full of witnesses, clerks, guards, townsfolk, even the boy's mother veiled in black. The friar read the words of judgment aloud, his voice steady. Then he lit the candle. For a long time nothing moved. The flame burned straight, its light soft and even. A murmur spread through the crowd. The friar frowned. He stepped closer, muttering a prayer under his breath. Then, without warning, a gust of wind swept through the chapel. The candle flickered, once, twice, and steadied again. But in that breath of movement, a drop of wax fell upon the friar's hand. And he cried out, clutching at the burn. The people gasped. The flame danced higher, as if mocking him. And then, quite calmly, it went out. Smoke coiled upward like a thin gray ribbon. The friar, shaken and pale, declared it proof enough. Her soul betrays her, he said. She communes with shadows. They took her away before the crowd could murmur further. No one spoke for her. The law was slow, but its path certain. She was to be held until confession, and if none came, to face the stake before Easter. But that night, the watchman who guarded her cell fell asleep. When he woke, the door was locked as before. Yet the cell was empty. On the floor by the cot lay a single candle, half burned, still warm to the touch. No wax had dripped. Its wick glowed faintly, though no fire touched it. They searched the city for weeks. Some said she had escaped across the Seine, hidden by the poor she had once fed. Others swore they saw her on the cathedral steps at night, kneeling before the Virgin's altar, her face lit by a candle that did not burn. Years later, a mason repairing the crypt beneath the bishop's hall found a small cavity in the wall. Inside was a clay pot sealed with wax. When opened, it held a single candle, whole, unlit, untouched by time. Beside it lay a note written in an unpracticed hand. "Let those who judge by flame remember. It is the breath, not the fire, that reveals the soul." The mason took it to the bishop. He read it once, and said nothing. The candle was never burned. They say the wax still carries the faint scent of rosemary and tallow. And if one looks closely, a single dark thread can be seen winding through its heart, like the memory of smoke. In Rouen, people still light candles for the lost, but they never let them burn to the end. For when the flame dies on its own, they say the soul who lit it has been forgiven. And if you walk the market square on certain cold mornings, before the stalls open and the bells begin, you might smell it, that same faint mix of wax and rosemary, and feel the air warm slightly, as if someone unseen has passed by, carrying a light too soft for the eyes to see. And in the background, the chapel doors creak gently, and the last curl of smoke rises into the pale morning, twisting like a prayer that has already been heard. The Glassblower's Vanishing Apprentice, Venice, 1429. The year was 1429. Venice lay under a thin veil of fog, its canals quiet, almost secretive, as gondolas cut their soft, wet trails through the black water. The air smelled of salt and timber, mixed with the faint sweetness of baked bread drifting from ovens along the Calle dei Fabbri. And somewhere in the narrow alleys behind the Rialto, a workshop glowed orange against the gray morning, its windows framed with black soot and shimmering reflections. The workshop belonged to Maestro Pietro, a man whose skill with glass was known from Murano to the lagoons beyond. His hands were strong but precise, able to stretch molten silica into shapes so delicate they seemed to breathe. He worked with his apprentice, a boy named Luca, who had come from the mainland with nothing but callous feet and the faint hope of learning a craft that could make him remarkable, or invisible, depending on how finely he worked. The boy was clever. He watched the furnace for hours, noting how the light danced across the molten pools, how the tongs must be turned just so, how the bubbles that formed in the glass could either spoil a goblet or render it precious. The master would sometimes hum while shaping the molten rods, a low, rhythmic hum that matched the hiss of the furnace and the gentle drip of water from a nearby basin. Luca learned to hum along, and sometimes, for a brief moment, the workshop seemed to breathe with them both. But one evening, a week before Lent, the master found the boy missing. The door was unlocked. The furnace still glowed, the tongs rested where he had left them, and the latest work, a set of wine goblets for a Venetian merchant, sat half-finished. No trace of Luca was anywhere, no footprints in the dust, no water disturbed, no whisper of his voice. Pietro asked the neighbors. No one had seen him leave. The streets were empty of children, save for stray cats and the occasional barking dog. And the canals, long, slow arteries through the city, offered no clue. The disappearance became a quiet murmur through the workshops and taverns of Venice. Glassblowers whispered that Luca had been taken by the lagoon spirits, drawn beneath the water by something brighter than the lanterns. Merchants said he had fled to the mainland, perhaps afraid of his master's temper. And Pietro, who rarely left the workshop, told only one person what he suspected, that the boy had vanished not through fear, but through glass itself. Several nights later, Pietro was working late, as he often did. The furnace's orange glow filled the workshop, throwing long shadows across the walls. He heard a soft scraping near the kiln, a sound that did not belong to metal or fire. He turned slowly, and for a moment, he thought he saw the reflection of a boy, not in the mirror, for there was none, but in the glass cooling on the shelf. The forms twisted subtly, as if trying to step out of their frames. He approached. A goblet quivered on the shelf, not from heat, not from draught, but as if the air itself held it. Then he heard the voice, faint but unmistakable. "Maestro!" He leaned closer, heart slow and careful. The goblet's surface rippled, and in it, he saw Luca's face, pale and distorted, mouth opening and closing, trying to form words that would not escape. He stumbled back. The furnace hissed. And when he looked again, the face was gone. From that night onward, odd things happened in the workshop. Glass twisted itself into shapes not intended, bubbles forming letters that dissolved before the morning light. Tools moved from one bench to another without being touched. And the faintest echo of a child's laughter could sometimes be heard when the wind shifted through the shutters. Pietro never spoke of it again. He completed the goblets for the merchant, who noticed nothing unusual beyond their exceptional brilliance. But the master knew. And Venice, which already had a taste for the marvelous and the uncanny, seemed to nod in secret agreement. The boy had gone, not lost, not stolen, but transformed. Years later, when the furnace cooled for the season, Pietro found a single goblet on the shelf, clear as water, unmarked, flawless. Inside, a small spiral of air, faint, like a fingerprint. When he held it to the light, he could swear it contained a tiny, watching face. A boy smiling just so, as if content to remain within the glass, where time moved differently, and footsteps made no sound. No one else ever saw it. The apprentice was never found. And the workshop, long after Pietro's death, retained a faint hum when the furnace was lit. A hum some swore was a boy's voice, echoing quietly in the heat of the glass. The canals outside continued to move, carrying boats and whispers alike. And at night, when the fog drifted through Venice, you could almost hear the clink of tongs, the hiss of molten silica, and a soft laughter carried lightly on the tide. And in the background, the faint lapping of the Voltava, steady, patient, and the subtle warmth of the furnace, glowing as if holding secrets within its ember heart. The baker's secret letter, Ghent, 1455. Ghent, in 1455, was a city alive with the smell of bread and smoke. The market square hummed with merchants trading wool, cheese, and small silks imported from Bruges. The canals gleamed like silver ribbons in the morning sun, carrying longboats heavy with goods from Flanders and beyond. And in the heart of the city, in a narrow alley just off the Grale, there stood a small bakery, its walls whitewashed, its windows clouded with flour. Its owner, Mariette Le Sueur, was a widow of 35 winters, with hands dusted in flour and eyes that had learned to watch the world quietly. She had taken over the shop after her husband's death from fever, and she ran it with steady precision, kneading dough at dawn, shaping loaves for the market, and serving customers with a nod or a soft word. To the townsfolk, she was reliable and unremarkable. But beneath her calm, she carried knowledge few knew, knowledge written in letters not meant to be read by ordinary eyes. It began with a letter, delivered not by courier, but tucked beneath the door one morning, wrapped in oilcloth. The parchment was soft, the ink slightly faded, and the words were simple. Deliver the bread tonight to the warehouse by the canal. Bring no one. Trust no one. Mariette read it twice, then folded it carefully and hid it beneath the lining of her apron. She could have ignored it. She could have delivered the loaves as usual. But something in the tone, the quiet urgency, compelled her. That evening, after the market closed and the sun had dipped behind the rooftops, she prepared a small batch of bread. Not the regular loaves, but loaves shaped carefully to conceal small parcels inside, each a folded scrap of parchment. The contents of the parcels were instructions, codes, names, and addresses. Information valuable to merchants, guilds, and even city officials. She carried the tray down the alley to the canal, moving as silently as a shadow. The warehouse was dark, its door ajar, and inside, a man waited. He was slight, pale, and his eyes reflected the lantern's faint glow. "Mariette?" he whispered. She nodded. He took the loaves, lifted one carefully, and examined it. Inside the crust, he found a folded sheet of paper, marked with the letters she had inscribed in a careful hand. He smiled faintly, then disappeared into the shadows, carrying the bread and its secret cargo. Mariette returned to her shop, heart steady but mind alert. The next morning, another letter arrived, with slightly different instructions. Again, she followed them, hiding messages in the loaves, moving like a silent river through the streets of Ghent. Weeks passed. The arrangement continued without incident, though Mariette always feared discovery. Guild inspectors, city guards, and rival bakers moved around her shop daily, oblivious to the tiny secrets tucked beneath crust and crumb. She learned to listen for the soft scrape of footsteps, the creak of doors, and the faint murmur of water against the canal. She learned to measure not just ingredients, but timing, the precise moment when the streets were empty enough, the wind still enough, for a message to travel unseen. Then, one evening, everything changed. A new letter arrived, but this one smelled of ink and fear. It warned of betrayal, that someone within the city watched her deliveries, and that her next move could determine not just her life, but the lives of others involved. Mariette froze. She could not simply abandon the work, too many depended on the messages she carried. She could not reveal the letters either, they would be destroyed, and those who trusted her would be endangered. So she acted carefully, delivering the loaves as usual, but taking a circuitous route through alleys and bridges, listening, pausing, and stepping lightly upon the stones. The streets were empty, save for the occasional dog, a stray cat, or the ripple of water beneath the gondola. The warehouse loomed ahead, dark and silent, and she placed the loaves carefully upon the dock. Then she slipped away before the man appeared unseen. That night she slept lightly, dreaming of the bread, the messages, and the shadowed eyes that might be watching. She dreamt of canals rising, sweeping letters away, and the soft aroma of yeast turning in her sleep. The next morning the letters stopped. No instructions came. No warnings, no thanks. It was as if the city itself had swallowed the correspondence. Mariette continued to bake, folding dough and shaping loaves, but the thrill of secrecy was gone. Years later, during renovations to the bakery, workers found a small compartment beneath the floorboards. Inside were remnants of the folded letters, yellowed with age, each carefully pressed to retain its message. The parchment was brittle, the ink faded, yet the words still whispered of danger, loyalty, and quiet courage. Mariette lived out her life in Ghent, baking for the market, nodding to customers, never speaking of the letters. But those who knew her remembered her hands, steady, unshakable, and the faint scent of yeast that seemed to linger long after she left the room. And if you wander past that same alley today, when the wind shifts over the canal and the bakeries are closed, you might catch a trace of flour on the air, and the faintest whisper of paper folding, as though some secrets still travel quietly, hidden in the soft crust of bread. And in the background, The soft lap of canal water against the docks, mixed with the faint aroma of baked wheat, carries the memory of one woman's careful, silent courage. The Apothecaries' Vanishing Potion, Lisbon, 1473. Lisbon in 1473 was a city of stone and water, its streets winding steeply from the Tagus River up to the Alfama, where the sunlight fell in thin, warm ribbons between walls and terraces. The markets smelled of citrus, of salt, and of herbs carefully bundled in cloth. And among these scents was the faint, persistent aroma of the apothecary's shop. A mixture of honey, dried flowers, and something sharper, almost metallic, that hinted at secrets kept in jars. The apothecary was a man named Tomás de Silva. He was neither young nor old, with a steady hand, clear eyes, and a voice that never rose above a quiet murmur. His shop was narrow, shelves lined with clay pots, bottles sealed with wax, and small, folded bundles of parchment containing recipes known only to him. He crafted remedies for coughs, fevers, and aches. But he also dabbled in tinctures for fortune, for love, and, when asked carefully, for forgetfulness. His apprentice, a boy named Miguel, had arrived in Lisbon 2 summers prior. He was clever, attentive, and unafraid of the sharp aromas, the heat of distillation, or the peculiar rhythm of grinding herbs into dust. Tomás trusted him, more than most masters would trust any young hand. And together they worked quietly, the bell over the door jingling softly only when a customer arrived. One evening, a visitor came, cloaked in dark wool. The streets were wet from a sudden drizzle, the lamps casting long reflections in puddles. The figure entered the shop silently, face shadowed beneath a hood. "I hear you craft what others cannot," the visitor said. "I require a potion. One that disappears." Tomás frowned. "Disappears?" "Yes. Leaves no trace. Consumed, and nothing remains. Not in the mouth, not in the stomach, not in the world." The visitor's eyes gleamed faintly in the lamplight. Tomás studied him carefully. He was certain this was not a request for healing. And yet, he could not refuse entirely. He agreed to try. Miguel watched, fascinated, as Tomás gathered rare herbs, mineral salts, and the tiniest drops of distilled wine. He worked slowly, deliberately, whispering small prayers under his breath. The mixture bubbled in a copper vessel, releasing a faint purple smoke. The aroma was sweet, like honey and violets, but underlying it was something cold, almost bitter, that made the hairs on Miguel's arms rise. When it was ready, Tomás poured the potion into a small crystal vial. The liquid shimmered as if it contained moving stars, shifting in the candlelight. The visitor took it carefully, sealed it, and placed a single gold coin upon the counter. Then he left, as silently as he had arrived. 2 nights later, Miguel noticed something strange. The vial was returned empty. No residue, no scent, no trace at all. Tomás examined the table, the shelves, even the floor beneath the counter. Nothing. The visitor came again, and again, requesting the potion, and each time, it vanished. Word of it spread slowly through whispers. The apothecary who could make something disappear. Some feared him, some admired him. But none understood the quiet magic and careful chemistry that allowed the potion to exist, and yet not exist. Then, one morning, Miguel arrived at the shop to find Tomás gone. The door was unlocked. The vial was still on the counter, but now the liquid seemed to move of its own accord, swirling into tiny shapes before settling again. The master had left no note, no explanation. Only the faint scent of lavender and iron lingered in the air. Weeks passed. Miguel attempted the potion himself, following Tomás's recipes with exacting care. He could replicate the color, the shimmer, the aroma. But it never vanished. And when he drank it, a single drop, careful as dew, he felt no change, no disappearance, no trace lost. He realized then that the magic had lived not in the ingredients, but in Tomas himself. His steady hand, his quiet concentration, his mind attuned to the subtle rhythms of body, air, and substance. Miguel remained in the shop, tending it as best he could. The visitor never returned. The city of Lisbon hummed around him, merchants, sailors, priests, and children weaving through the streets, oblivious to the tiny, powerful secrets held in jars and bottles. And sometimes, at night, when the wind shifted just so through the alley, Miguel thought he heard a soft voice whispering through the shelves. Even what disappears leaves a trace in memory. Years later, the apothecary's shop was taken over by another. But the vial remained on the counter, shimmering faintly. And those who looked closely could see the liquid swirl like tiny stars, holding within it the memory of one man's quiet, vanishing genius. And in the background, the Atlantic wind hummed softly through the narrow streets, mixing with the scent of herbs and salt, and the faint, echoing sound of a quiet potion disappearing into the night. The Cartographer's Secret Map, Seville, 1492. Seville, in 1492, was alive with the stir of ships preparing to leave for lands unknown. The docks smelled of salt and tar, the air heavy with smoke from braziers burning resin to keep the damp chill at bay. Sailors loaded barrels, merchants shouted prices, and the clatter of ropes and pulleys formed a gentle, constant rhythm against the lapping river waters. Yet tucked away from all this noise, in a narrow alley near the Alcazar, a small workshop glowed quietly, candlelight spilling over parchment-strewn tables. Its occupant was Don Alonso de Mendoza, a cartographer whose reputation rested on accuracy, secrecy, and a patient hand. His maps were prized by merchants and navigators alike, each line measured with a delicate eye, each coastline recorded with care. He worked with ink, compasses, and calipers, and often hummed a soft, almost imperceptible tune as he traced rivers and mountains, his mind moving as slowly and deliberately as his quill. The cartographer had a secret, a map unlike any other. It was small, folded into layers of parchment, hidden beneath the false bottom of a drawer. It showed lands across the ocean, places whispered about by sailors, rumored islands that existed only in fragments of stories. And within its lines, Alonso had marked safe harbors, currents, and dangers that could make or break a voyage. One evening, shortly after dusk, a visitor arrived at the door. Not a merchant, not a sailor, but a scholar, cloaked in brown wool, with eyes that seemed to measure every shadow. "I hear you possess knowledge of lands unseen," he said softly. Alonso nodded, not fully trusting, but unable to deny the truth. The scholar leaned close, whispering of patrons who would pay handsomely for maps that were not for public eyes, maps that could determine wealth, influence, and power. He left a small silver coin upon the table as a token. Alonso studied it, then shook his head. He was careful with what he shared, even in secrecy. Over the following weeks, more visitors came. Each requested the secret map, each offering gold, promises, or veiled threats. Alonso, patient and deliberate, refused them all. He rolled the map, tied it with a ribbon, and hid it beneath the floorboards. Yet every night he checked it, ensuring no one had discovered its hiding place. Then, one night, a candle burned low, its flame flickering against the walls. Alonso heard soft footsteps in the alley, faint but deliberate. He peered through the window. A shadow moved toward the door. He extinguished the lamp, held his breath, and waited. The door creaked open. A figure entered, not seen fully in the dim light, and moved directly toward the table where the map lay hidden. Alonso followed silently, heart steady, knowing that discovery could be dangerous, yet unwilling to confront the intruder openly. He watched as the figure lifted the false drawer, examined the map, and paused. For a long moment, there was nothing but the whisper of parchment. Then the intruder spoke softly. "Such knowledge must not fall into the wrong hands." He left the map where it was, rolled and tied, as Alonso had hidden it, and just as silently, he disappeared into the night. Alonso never learned the stranger's name. Some said it was a royal spy, sent to ensure the map remained secret. Others whispered it was an agent of fate itself, guarding knowledge too dangerous for ordinary men. Years later, after Alonso's death, the map was discovered by a grandson, curious and careful. He opened the folded parchment and traced the coastlines with his finger, feeling the rhythm of his grandfather's hand in each line, the patience and secrecy that had guided every stroke. The map eventually made its way into a collection, though the precise locations of some harbors were never recorded elsewhere. And even today, scholars debate certain islands marked upon it, whether they existed, or were imagination, or a warning hidden in ink. In Seville, the wind still carries the faint scent of the river, of resin and salt, and the quiet streets of the old quarter hum with the echo of sailors' footsteps, the turning of parchment, and the soft, deliberate tapping of compasses on wooden tables. Alonso's secret map remains a symbol, not of treasure, nor of conquest, but of patience, observation, and the quiet courage to guard what must be kept. And in the background, the sound of the river lapping against the docks, the faint rustle of parchment, and the gentle glow of a candle still burning somewhere in the night. Gentle wrap-up. And so we leave the streets, the workshops, the chapels, and the quiet rooms where secrets lingered, where footsteps were measured, letters folded, and candles flickered in low light. Each story we have told carries its own soft echo. The monk whose manuscript vanished beneath stone, the cobbler whose midnight visitor left no trace, the widow whose candle spoke truth in its dying flame, the apprentice who became part of the glass he shaped, the baker who carried letters hidden in bread, the apothecary whose potion vanished into memory, and the cartographer whose map traced lands known only to him and the stars. All these tales remind us that history is made of quiet moments as much as grand events, of whispers, careful hands, and shadows that move just out of sight. And now, as your eyes grow heavy and your thoughts drift like ink upon parchment, may the soft rhythm of these stories guide you into rest. And may your dreams carry you through hidden alleys, quiet workshops, and candlelit halls, safe, warm, and gently cradled by the past. Sleep well, and let the stories linger like a faint candle flame at the edge of your mind.